November 10th, 1975, a massive freighter, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, sails right into a monster storm and is never seen again. Today, we're going to open up the case file on what is, without a doubt, one of the most famous and haunting shipwrecks in American history. Okay, let's get into it.
You know, that line, it's from Gordon Lightfoot's incredible song about the wreck. And it perfectly captures the terror, doesn't it? The sheer helplessness of being out on that water that night. It really puts you right there in the middle of the human tragedy at the heart of this whole mystery.
I mean, you have to understand, the Edmund Fitzgerald was an absolute giant, a real workhorse of the Great Lakes, longer than 2 football fields put together. But on this night, in a storm with hurricane-force winds and waves the size of buildings, it just vanished. Poof! Disappeared from radar without a single SOS.
And with the ship, 29 men, the entire crew. They all went down. There were no survivors, not one. And no bodies were ever recovered from the lake's unbelievably cold, deep water.
So to even begin to understand what could have happened, investigators had to piece together the ship's final hours. They had to follow its path, step by step, right into the heart of a storm that would go down in history.
Okay, look at this timeline. What's really striking here is just how fast things went from bad to worse. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Captain McSorley radios in some damage on the deck and a list. That means the ship is tilting, but it sounds like he's got it under control. The pumps are running. But then, less than an hour later, boom, both radars are out. He's basically flying blind in a blizzard, and from there it just gets worse. He reports a bad list and that they're taking on massive waves over the deck. And then, you get to that final call at 7:10 p.m. It's so eerily calm. But just 10 minutes later, the Fitzgerald is gone from the radar. Vanished.
So this map, it shows you the likely paths of the Fitzgerald and the Anderson, which was another ship following about 10 miles behind it. Now you can see they actually steered away from the usual shipping lanes. They were trying to use the Canadian shore over here as a shield from the storm. But the terrible irony is, right as they rounded Michipicoten Island and made a run for the safety of Whitefish Bay, they sailed directly into the most violent part of the entire storm.
We are holding our own. Think about that. Those were the last words, the very last words, ever heard from the Edmund Fitzgerald. The captain of the Anderson had just radioed over to ask, how are you guys doing with your problems? And that's the reply he got. No panic in his voice, no mayday call, just a routine, almost casual sign-off, minutes before total catastrophe. It's just chilling. So with no survivors and no final message, the only witness left was the ship itself, the wreckage, lying on the bottom of Lake Superior. The whole search for answers had to move from the storm on the surface to 530 feet beneath the waves.
And the first huge clue came when they finally located the ship with underwater surveys. And it wasn't in one piece. Take a look at this sketch from the investigation. The Fitzgerald had snapped in 2. The bow and stern sections were found about 170 feet apart, with this huge field of twisted metal between them. So right away, the crucial takeaway is, this wasn't just a sinking. It was a catastrophic, violent structural failure.
And these 2 images, wow, they just illustrate the sheer violence of what happened. On the one hand, you have the bow section. It plunged to the bottom and sits there, mostly upright in the mud. But then you look at the stern section, and it's completely upside down. Just think about the forces required to do that, to tear a 700-foot ship in half and flip the stern section like a toy as it sank. It's just unimaginable.
Okay, so when investigators sent remote cameras down to get a closer look, they started to see a really critical pattern of damage. And the focus zeroed in on the 21 massive steel hatch covers. These are what seal the cargo hold. What did they find? Well, several were just gone. Others were mangled. And the coamings, that's the raised steel frame they clamp onto, they were buckled and torn apart. And this damage, right here, will become the absolute foundation for the official story of what happened.
So, the evidence on the lake bed, it was undeniable. But how you interpret that evidence, well, that's where things get complicated. The investigation actually produced 2 very different, competing theories for what caused the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
All right, let's break down the 2 sides of the argument, because this is where the mystery really gets deep. The too many theories point to completely different types of failure. On one side, you have the official finding. It blames a catastrophic failure of the hatch covers on the deck. But then you have the dissenting opinion.
which argues the fatal wound came from below, when the ship scraped over an underwater reef. And look, this isn't just some technical debate. It gets to the heart of the question. Was this a tragic accident? A ship overwhelmed by an unstoppable storm? Or was it a preventable navigational error?
So this right here is the official conclusion. The theory goes something like this. The first bits of damage that the captain reported, the list, the broken vents, that allowed some water into the ship's ballast tanks. Now at the same time, you probably have water leaking in through poorly sealed hatches. All of this makes the ship ride lower and lower in the water. And then, a monster wave, or maybe a series of them, just smashes down on the deck and collapses a hatch cover. The cargo hold would have flooded in mere seconds. Game over.
And here's something that's really, really interesting. Regulations had actually changed over the years, and they allowed the Fitzgerald to be loaded down with more cargo than ever before. If you look at this table, by 1973, it's winter freeboard. That's just the distance from the waterline up to the main deck. It was over 3 feet less than when the ship was first built. What does that mean? It means the deck was 3 feet closer to those gigantic waves, making it way more vulnerable to being swamped. And that is a key piece of the puzzle for the official theory.
But then, you have this incredibly forceful statement from Captain Cooper of the Anderson. Remember, he's the last guy to ever talk to Captain McSorley. Right after the accident, he was recorded saying this, and he was absolutely convinced that the Fitzgerald had gone over the dangerous shallow area, the shoal near Caribou Island. This belief, it's the cornerstone of the whole other theory.
So, according to this theory, the ship shoaled. That just means its bottom scraped across a reef near Caribou Island that maybe wasn't charted all that well. That's what caused the initial damage reported at 3:30. Not waves on deck, but a hole in the hull. A gash like that would have started a slow but unstoppable flood that the pumps just couldn't keep up with. So for the next few hours, the ship was slowly losing buoyancy, getting heavier and heavier, until it finally just nosedived into a wave and was gone.
So while the investigators were debating the technical cause, the story of the Fitzgerald was already becoming something else. It was transforming from a news headline into a modern American legend, making sure that the ship and its 29 crewmen would never, ever be forgotten.
It was less than a year after the sinking that Canadian singer-songwriter Gordon Lightfoot released his ballad, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and that haunting song became a massive, massive international hit. For millions of people, it is the story. It cemented the tragedy in our collective memory in a way no news report or documentary ever could.
I love this quote from someone who grew up in Michigan. It just perfectly shows the deep, deep cultural impact of that song, especially for people who live around the Great Lakes. It's really not just a song for them. It's a piece of local history. It's a lesson about the awesome power of the lakes, and it's a tribute to the men who were lost that night.
And of course, we have to give credit to the incredible effort of the US and Canadian Coast Guards. I mean, these guys conducted a massive search in absolutely horrendous conditions. They were out there in the very same storm that took the Fitzgerald down. And later, they're the ones who led the painstaking underwater investigation that gave us all the evidence we've been looking at tonight. They're the ones who helped piece this tragic story together.
So where does that leave us? What truly sank the Edmund Fitzgerald? Was it a failure of the ship itself, the hatches finally giving way to the overwhelming force of nature, just a tragic accident? Or was it a single mistake, a fatal navigational error that led to a grounding? The evidence from the deep seems to point one way, but the testimony from the last eyewitness points in a completely different direction. And after all these years, the debate rages on. Because the answer really changes the nature of the tragedy, and the final certain truth, well, that remains a secret, lost to the waves of Lake Superior.